Hello, my name is Robert Paul Wolff. Welcome back for the 7th in this series of lectures on ideological critique. Those of you who have been following these lectures will notice that I'm not wearing a sweater today. The reason is simple. After I posted the 6th lecture on YouTube, I had an email from Tom Cathcart. Not the imaginary Tom Cathcart who is sitting just here with my other former students in my imaginary classroom, the real Tom Cathcart, who has been watching these lectures on YouTube. He told me that there were problems with the sound which resulted from the fact that my lavalier microphone was interfering with my beard, or my beard was interfering with my lavalier microphone. So I took the sweater off so I could put the microphone lower down. And now I think we can start. Each week I've been welcoming another former student to my imaginary classroom as a way of personalizing these lectures so that I'm not just talking to a camcorder sitting on my desk. Last week I welcomed the famous philosopher Thomas Nagel, who was my student 56 years ago at Harvard. Today I'm going to reach back only 50 years, 51 years actually, to 1965, when I was teaching at Columbia University. That year, a young Oxford student showed up to spend a year on a fellowship in America studying philosophy, and he asked whether he could sit in on my lectures on ethical theory. Naturally, I said yes. At the end of this graduate course, all of the graduate students were required to submit a 20-page term paper, and this young man asked whether he could submit a paper too, even though he wasn't taking the course for credit. Well, I thought I'll have a pile of 20-page papers. One more paper, more or less, won't make much difference. So I said, sure, go ahead. The last day of class, this young man submitted a brilliant 110-page defense of act utilitarianism. Those of you who are familiar with the field of philosophy may not be surprised to learn that this young man's name was Derek Parfit. Derek has a way of doing that, I gather. At any rate, Derek, I haven't seen you in 50 years, and you have become a famous philosopher in the time since, but perhaps you will join Tom Nagel and my other students in my imaginary classroom so that we could get started on this last lecture on Wilson's book Land Filled with Flies and his ideological critique of ethnography. Let me just remind you of where we are in our discussion. Last week I went through some of the detailed evidence that Wilson produces to show that the Zhou, these people living in the Kalahari, were in fact not holdovers from the Paleolithic past, not hunter-foragers, hunter-gatherers who had been living the same sort of life that their ancestors had lived 100,000 years earlier, but in fact were residents of an area that was complex, interconnected with trade routes that connected up with the entire Eurasian network of trade and economy, that they had class structures, that therefore they had politics, that they were in fact modern human beings, not holdovers from an ancient past. That left one crucial question. If they aren't Paleolithic hunter-gatherers whom time has forgotten in this remote outback of the Kalahari, who are the Zhou? And today I will tell you what Wilson discovered when he looked into this question. But first I want to take up one small matter that I didn't have time to talk about last week, and which I think is an important side note in this entire discussion of ethnography and so-called primitive peoples. It has to do with the notion of property of nomadic and foraging peoples. You will recall last week that we saw that the Zhou and others living in the Kalahari did have cattle. They had quite obviously differential numbers of cattle, since there were some sites that had been excavated that showed young cattle being killed, which suggested wealthy owners of cattle capable of killing their young cattle for the good food rather than waiting till they were old and past the point where they could reproduce. And there were beads and other trade goods which had been traded 700 miles up from the coast, the Indian Ocean coast, and had come all the way from India and other places like that, making it clear that the Zhou and others living in that area were integrated into the economy of the world. But they didn't have property, so far as we can tell, in the sense that we understand it. That is, pieces of land defined by borders with signs on them saying, "This is ours, keep out." Instead, the Jew, as you might expect, since they lived in a semi-arid plain or desert, had property rights in water holes, among other things. Now these property rights didn't exclude others from using the water holes. They gave certain people privileged access to those water holes, not only for themselves but for their cattle. And that property right, privileged access, first use of the water hole, was an important form of property for pastoralist peoples of this sort, not just in the Kalahari, but in many other parts of the world. You will recall Wilmson's evocative phrase, "strategy selected memory in the construction of kinship relations." I talked about that when I talked about kinship ties and the relationship between what the Jew do and what people in Jane Austen novels do, or as Louis Namier showed us, what people in 18th century England did. Well, essentially what the Jew would do, according to Wilmson, is to tweak or interpret their kinship relationships in order to improve their access to property. So, for example, if there was an understood rule that a certain kinship relationship, cousin of cousin of cousin or whatever, made a young man an appropriate husband for a young woman, then the parents of that young woman, if they saw that this young man did not have much in the way of property, might look around for another young man who had better access to water holes, and they would then invent or interpret or bend kinship relationships in order to demonstrate that that young man was actually a better mate for their daughter than the young man who might technically, according to the rules of kinship, be the appropriate husband. They would, in short, do the same sort of thing that Jane Austen's characters do, the same sorts of things that intelligent, thoughtful people anywhere would do, who were relying on kinship relationships to advance their economic interests. Well, this notion of property has no particular place in the legal systems of the colonists who showed up from Europe, either from the continent where they were bringing Roman law, or from England where they were bringing the common law. And this was true not only in Africa, but in Australia and many other parts of the world. What would happen then is that the traditional property rights of the indigenous peoples would not be recognized by the courts established by the colonists in order to administer their territories. It wasn't even necessarily that they were trying to expropriate these indigenous people. They simply didn't recognize the kinds of property claims that traditionally they made, because in the Roman law or the English common law, those notions of property had no place. And it turns out that anthropologists, ethnographers all over the world have worked very hard to defend the traditional property rights of the peoples that they are studying. In this fight, by the way, Wilmson and Lee are on the same side. Both Lee and his associates and Wilmson, who is doing a critique of the work of Lee and his associates, would work together in order to defend the indigenous peoples and their property rights, and to argue before the courts that those rights ought to be recognized and ought to be given some legal reinforcement and recognition, even though they didn't correspond to the notion of property which could be found in the English common law or in Roman law. Wilmson actually edited a book, a collection of essays devoted to this. It's called "We Are Here, Politics of Aboriginal Land Tenure," edited by Edwin Wilmson. And it's a rather interesting collection of essays which shows you that this problem arose all over the world. There's a fascinating kind of connection between this and what happened to the law of slavery in the United States during the pre-Civil War period, and especially in the colonial period. What happened was that when the English colonists showed up and took control of North America and started to bring in slaves, several problems arose. The first problem, of course, was that there was no status of slavery in English common law, a fact that we will talk about in my last lecture devoted to a novel by Jane Austen. But another problem was this. In English common law, the status of the child followed the status of the father. So if an aristocratic man, for example, had a bastard son, even though that son could not inherit the aristocrat's wealth, he was nevertheless recognized as an aristocrat because his father had been an aristocrat. And in fact, if you're familiar with English names that have the word Fitz in front of them, that word is traditionally the indication of such a non-legal relationship, a bastard son. Well, in the United States, the slave owners periodically and quite frequently raped their slave women. And the children of those matches, of those rapes, ought, according to English common law, have been free because the father was free. But the children were valuable property because slaves were expensive, and if you could produce slaves by raping your slave women, that increased your wealth. So in a series of complicated cases, the law was changed in America so that even though they were using the English common law, they changed the law so that the children of slave women were themselves chattel property and not free men and women, free children. All of this is an interesting sidelight to what we've been talking about. But now let's come back to the central question that has not yet been answered. We've seen that the Zhou are not Paleolithic holdovers. But if they aren't, who are they? And to this, Wilmson offers a very complex answer based on a great deal of research, both archaeological research and archival research. What Wilmson did, what the Lees did not do, was to examine the archives and the documents in the Botswana government offices, in the South African government offices, and also to examine the published reports of early colonial administrators and also early merchant traders. And from this, he reconstructed a story of what had gone on in the Kalahari over a very long period of time. It's a complicated story. Let me try to give it to you in a relatively simple version so that we can see what's going on. The archaeological evidence that Wilmson looks at reveals that a form of developed pastoralism, which is to say, or agro-pastoralism, which is to say both agriculture and cattle herding, is at least 2,000 years old in the Kalahari area. 2,000 years old. This is not something just introduced in the last 100 years. For at least 2 millennia, people living in the Kalahari, which is to say the ancestors of the Zhou, and many other peoples, have been involved in cattle herding. And we've already seen that the excavated sites give evidence of the slaughtered cattle and the mix of cattle bones and bones of wild animals. Let me start by reading you a passage from Wilmson. He says, a tripartite hierarchy of settlements may be discerned in terms of size, site, location, length of occupation, proportion of exotic trade items, and relative numbers of domestic stock. Social stratification of the inhabitants seems clear. So the first thing that we find is that in these excavated sites, going back several thousand years, there is not only evidence of non-hunter-gatherer foraging, that is to say of pastoralism, there's evidence of social hierarchy, which carries with it political hierarchy. Then he goes on. It appears that at this early date, members of an elite social stratum were already able to extract prime food resources, along with a surplus product distilled in value as exotic trade goods from subordinate classes for their own use. Many, if not most, of the prime animals slaughtered at Tutsuamangala, someplace with an unpronounceable name, must have been obtained from lower-ranked locations, for a sustained offtake of breeding stock would quickly reduce the resident herd to unsustainable numbers. It may be appropriate to think of tertiary site herders as cattle managers for centralized elites, rather than as cattle owners in their own right. You see what Wilson is inferring from the evidence. There were central locations where wealthy residents had herds of cattle and where they slaughtered young cattle for their own food. This must have meant that they kept bringing in more cattle from off locations, because otherwise the herd that they had would be reduced to unmanageable and unsustainable size very quickly. So what you have is a situation in which you have wealthy pastoralists who are living high off the hog or high off the cattle, as it were, and then you have subordinate populations whose cattle they are drawing on, whom they are exploiting in Marxist terms. They are extracting a surplus from those other populations. The other populations are getting enough to live, but when they have more than enough to live, some of it gets taken away and brought to the central location. You have, in short, a standard situation of an economic hierarchy in which the more wealthy are in part deriving their wealth by expropriating the less wealthy. This is not the picture that Lee and their associates were painting. This is a picture of a class structure. Now, that's what we can tell from this. That's what we can tell from this archaeological evidence. Then Wilson tells us, several independent lines of evidence agree that Proto-Herero-speaking Bantu peoples entered the western part of southern Africa roughly 2,000 years ago, where they found Khoisan-speaking herders. These Bantu speakers obtained cattle, or at least a cattle-keeping vocabulary, from Khoisan herders in this region. In short, the San people were there first, the Zhou. They were there first. Then the Bantu people, speaking Bantu, a different language group, came in. And now what happened is, over a period of time, a sequence of events which led eventually to the expropriation and the dispossession of the San. To put it in its simplest terms, and to get a little ahead of ourselves, in a long-standing struggle that went on, struggle for power, struggle for wealth, struggle for cattle, struggle for control, the San, the Zhou, were the losers. This happened in a series of stages. Before even Europeans showed up, there were a series of wars, struggles between different groups of people called the Difikana, which in some language or other means time of troubles. Sounds like an Irish problem, but at any rate, there was a series of wars, and certain groups of people were successful, and other groups of people were less successful. The Zhou were among the less successful. Before even the Europeans showed up, this struggle was already going on, and the Zhou were losing out. Then, what happened is European traders showed up. Before even colonial settlers, European traders showed up. They were there for ivory, they were there for ostrich feathers, which were in great fashion in European capitals, and they engaged, they started to trade metal pots, beads, other things that the local residents wanted in return for the goods that were being produced in a surplus for the market by the people who were living there. And these traders hired the people who lived there as their workers. They hired them to go out and get ivory, they hired them to go out and get ostrich feathers, they hired them to look after cattle herds. In short, what you had was workers who were being employed by the colonial traders, and the workers were, among others, the Zhou. Now, then what happens is colonization by Germans and by the English. Now, here's what happened when the Germans and the English showed up. They showed up to a situation in which there already was a complex structure of indigenous peoples, different tribes or groups, different nations, in different political relationships with one another. And the colonists, in effect, built their colonial empires on top of that structure. They wanted to control the area, and in order to do that, what they would do is identify who was one of the winners, who was a local big man, and then make a deal with him, give him weapons, give him other support, in return for that person providing goods, surplus for them, which they could then send back to Europe. In short, they use the existing social and economic and political structure as the base on which to build their administration. Here is a little bit of what Wilson has to say. He says, talking about what happened in the 1890s. No, let me just back up before I read this passage. For a while, this kind of relationship flourished. It was good for some of the local inhabitants, not so good for others, including the Jew. But then in the 1890s, things changed. And he says, during the previous decades, the entire region had pulsed with activity. Everybody had had a piece of the everyday action, no matter how that eventually worked against long-term interests. Now, the region seemed as empty and remote as it was later conceived to be. What happened was two things. First, the demand for things like ostrich feathers and elephant tusks drained the region of elephants and ostriches. That is to say, the local peoples ran out of the source of the goods that were wanted by the Europeans. The second thing that happened was a shift in taste. The demand for ostrich feathers fell off because new tastes were wanted in the capitals of Europe, and ostrich feathers were no longer in demand. So that even though there might be more ostriches, none of the traders were interested in getting the ostrich feathers, so the local inhabitants stopped going out and killing ostrich and producing the ostrich feathers. Now the region seemed as empty and remote as it was later conceived to be, Wilson says. The remoteness imagined by outside observers was not indigenous, but was created by the collapse of mercantile capital, which had in its genesis and growth dismembered well-worn native links of communication. That is to say, what happened was the traders came in, the mercantile interests came in. They disrupted what was going on because they had demands which were different from the economic activities of those who were living there. This pushed people into producing trade goods. Then, when the mercantile demand collapsed, the long-standing relationships and economic activities had been destroyed by this mercantile activity, and the area became remote because people left it. It seemed to be remote not because it was a land left behind for 100,000 years, but because European economic interests had moved on to other areas and other goods. It was recently remote, not historically remote. Now that tells us a little something about what was going on. Wilson goes on, a place where glass beads from Asia, mollusk shells from the Eastern Sea more than 1,500 kilometers away, and it is no longer unreasonable to suppose, colorful cloth were important trade goods more than a millennium ago, is not isolated. A place where early in the 19th century a boy is bought for cloth and glass beads, educated in England, and returns as a man to prepare his son in turn to be an emissary of a 20th century American-inspired ideology, is not without contacts in the world. These are stories he had told in the book. People who repeatedly assassinate their oppressors, reappropriate portions of their confiscated property, and contribute to causes for the realignment of policy, are not passively dispossessed by choice or circumstance. The conclusion is inescapable. It is not possible to speak of the Kalahari's isolation protected by its own vast distances. To those inside, the outside, whatever outside they may have been at any moment, was always present. The appearance of isolation and its reality of dispossessed poverty are recent products of a process that unfolded over 2 centuries and culminated in the last moments of the colonial era. In short, the answer, who are the Zhou, is simply this. They are traditional inhabitants, among many others, of the area, engaged in agro-pastoralism, who in the struggles before the arrival of the Europeans, and then in the mercantile and colonial activities of the Europeans, lost out. They were the underclass. They were not the favored and successful indigenous inhabitants. They were the unfavored and unsuccessful indigenous inhabitants. The Zhou, in short, are the poor of the Kalahari. They are not traditional hunter-gatherers. They are the underclass, the poor. That's who they are. That's who they were. They weren't always that way. They weren't that way 2,000 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 500 years ago, but they became that way in the last several hundred years as a consequence of the interaction of local struggles in which they were the losers and the interaction with colonial European mercantile interests and then colonial political interests in the period before the end of the Second World War. So the Zhou are not the fantasy that Lee and his associates thought. They are simply poor. But that's not the end of the story, because there is, in fact, one more little bit of this story that is so astonishing that I've saved it for the last. I haven't been able to show you some of the video of the Zhou, but had you been able to see it, you would have seen that the Zhou are quite small. If you think about Bushmen, so-called, that's what you would imagine. They are quite small, quite thin, wiry little people, very efficient at dealing with the world around them. Lee and his associates saw this and concluded that what they were seeing was an evolutionary adaptation to the food sources and the living conditions of the Kalahari. That over tens of thousands of years, the people living this hunter-gatherer, forager existence had sort of self-selected for thin, short stature because that made it more possible for them to live in the world in which they found themselves. So that their size and their physical conformation was an evolutionary adaptation in the way that happens with other mammals and other species. Williamson takes a look at the data, a detailed, careful look at the data, and he discovers something absolutely staggering. To put it as simple-mindedly as I can, the Zhou aren't small because they have made an evolutionary adaptation to the Kalahari. They are small because they are hungry. They are hungry as children. They don't get enough to eat. They don't get enough to eat because they are poor. And if you give them enough to eat, from the time they are born, they grow bigger, just as all people grow bigger. It's a familiar fact that the workers in 19th century England were shorter than the aristocrats and the wealthy business people. Why? Because they didn't get enough food to eat. That's what happened to the Zhou. Now think about how astonishing this is. Imagine somebody who comes to New York or to another big city and sees men foraging through dumpsters, sleeping in the streets, foraging through dumpsters, going through the garbage of restaurants looking for food, and comes to the conclusion that these are traditional hunter-gatherer foragers, instead of realizing that they are homeless, poor people who are just desperately trying to find enough food to stay alive. That, in effect, is what Williamson is saying Lee and his associates did. They were that blind to the world they were living in, to the people they were looking at, to the people they claimed to care so much about. They simply didn't pay attention to the fact that they were hungry. Lee and his associates complain a good deal about the fact that the Jews are constantly begging for food. But it never crosses their minds that they're begging for food because they're perpetually hungry. That is, I have to say, the most, of all the things that Wilson says, of all the evidence he produces of who the Jews really are, that is, to me, the most astonishing. That Lee and his associates simply couldn't see that the people in front of their faces were poor, hungry people. That's who they were. Why were they in the Kalahari? Because they'd been pushed off their cattle posts. They'd been deprived of their cattle. They'd been kicked out. And so they made a living as best they could. When they could get jobs serving as cattle herders, they took them. When they could get jobs working in the South African mines, they took those jobs. When they could get jobs working for traders or for local administrators, they took those jobs. But when no jobs were available, they foraged. They did hunter-gatherer. They hunted and they gathered because that was the way they could stay alive. This is not some romantic, idyllic, egalitarian mode of prehistoric existence which can be held up as a model to modern capitalist people living in modern capitalist societies. This is a group of people in a modern capitalist society who are the losers, the outsiders, the poor. That's who the Jews actually are. Well, let's go all the way back to the beginning, to my lectures on Mannheim. You remember that I laid down 3 conditions that Mannheim had given us for determining that something is an ideology or a utopia. First, it must serve to justify the power and defend the interests of a dominant political, economic, or social group, and it must make fundamental change seem unlikely. Or if it's a utopia, it must undermine that authority and power and make change seem likely. Second, it must be false. It must distort reality. And third, it must be so patently false that only interested bias and not genuine intellectual error can explain why it is believed. And as I said, to be a utopia in Mannheim's usage of that term is to serve to make radical change of the present order seem likely or inevitable, but also to be patently false so that only interested bias could make one believe in that view. On Wilson's view, Lee's ethnography of the Jew meets all of these 3 tests of a utopia. That is to say, it is first of all an effort by these 60s and 70s Americans and Canadians to celebrate an alternative to the life they see in America and Canada around them that they don't like, that they are opposed to. They're opposed to the Vietnam War, they're opposed to commodification of life, they're opposed to all of the things to inequality, they're opposed to all of the things they see around them, and in the Jew, they want to be able to believe that there is an alternative possible, a good alternative, an alternative furthermore that is rooted in the history of the human experience, an alternative that existed for 200,000 years before the modern world started. And so they come to the Kalahari and they look for it, and that is what they find, even though all the evidence speaks against it. It's a false view, as Wilson has shown, and it is so patently false that only a utopian self-deception could lead Lee and his associates to believe it. It's patently false because, first of all, they know that the Jew herd cattle. They know that the Jew have trade goods. They know that the Jew get jobs. They know all those things. And they know that the Jew are constantly begging for food, and yet they can't see what the Jew really are. Let me read one last passage from Wilson. This is from near the very end of the book. He says, "This is the heart of the matter. San-speaking people have not always been as they are now, not even recently, nor have they been as ethnography has depicted them. Their current state is the result of transformations in relations of production involving many other peoples in a social formation that has itself undergone transformation of profound proportions during the past 2 centuries, and that during the past 2 millennia has experienced other transformations that we are only now beginning to comprehend. There is nothing to be peeled away to reveal an evolutionary residue that does not exist. This is the point of departure from which future anthropology and administration must approach these people. In short, what Wilson is saying to us is that ethnography, as it has traditionally been practiced, must give way to modern political economy of the sort that we find in the writings of Marx and many other political economists. The people, the Jew-like so-called primitive peoples in other parts of the world, are part of the modern world. They are part of complexes of trade and power and politics, and they must be understood in that way. Well, this is a classic example of an ideological critique. When I started, you'll recall, I told you that in order to do ideological critique, it is necessary to descend out of the clouds, not to talk about alienation and false consciousness and reification and all those other fancy terms, but instead to look at the detail, the substantive detail of particular cases, that only by doing that can we really understand how ideological critique works. This 4-lecture sequence on Wilson and his critique of Lee is my effort to show you exactly how that works. We're going to go on next week to another subject, which I'll mention in just a moment, but I want to pause to emphasize that this, in my judgment, is the right way to do ideological critique. Now, it's a lot of work. Wilson spent years living with the Jew, studying them, looking through archives, doing archaeological digs, studying the results of other people's archaeological digs, gathering data. You can't do an ideological critique on the fly, as it were, just by sitting in your armchair and spinning out a couple of fancy phrases. You have to get into the detail of the particular subject that you are doing a critique of. And the Wilson is a classic example of that kind of ideological critique. Now, next week, we're going to move on to an entirely different area. We're going to leave ethnography and anthropology, and we're going to move to literary criticism. Can't get much further from ethnography than that, it seems to me. We're going to take a look at a book by Henry Louis Gates, Jr. called The Signifying Monkey. And we will be spending 2 weeks taking a look at Gates's work, which is both a theory of African American literature and a theory of African American literary criticism, not the same thing as literature, and also an ideological critique of standard literary criticism. As we will see, although Gates hides it very nicely and doesn't reveal his hand in the way that Wilson does, Gates is engaged in a critique of the high priests of literary criticism. He is doing something which he calls signifying on them, and we'll find out what that is. That's the end of Wilson. Next week on to literary criticism. I'll see you then. Thank you.